You're watching the History Fella channel, and in this video we're looking at the Dalton brothers. The Dalton brothers came from a very respectable family and lived on a homestead in Oklahoma Territory. There were 5 brothers: Frank, Grattan or Grat, Bob, Bill and Emmett, and all were hard-working young men. Frank Dalton became a deputy U.S. Marshal serving under Judge Isaac Parker, but was killed in 1887 whilst attempting to arrest 3 whiskey runners in Fort Smith. Although 2 of the criminals were killed during the incident and the 3rd hanged, the brothers began to be disillusioned with the law and grew less law-abiding as time went on. Grat Dalton was appointed a deputy U.S. Marshal in Frank's place, and later his 2 brothers Bob and Emmett joined him. Bob Dalton was the first to step outside the law when he shot dead a man by the name of Charlie Montgomery, who had been seeing Bob's girlfriend. He and his brother Emmett took the body to Coffeyville, claiming that they had caught the man stealing from a stable and that he had been shot resisting arrest. Then Grat and Bob were involved in the theft of horses from a ranch near Baxter Springs, Kansas, and had their badges taken away. A little while later, brother Emmett was dismissed. Deciding that there was more money to be made on the other side of the law, the brothers formed a gang by recruiting a number of known outlaws, including Bill Powers, Dick Broadwell, and George Bittercreek Newcomb. The gang's first robbery took place at a gambling saloon in Silver City, New Mexico. Chased by a posse, the gang split up in an effort to confuse them. Emmett and Newcomb went to Indian Territories, whilst Bob Dalton and some of the others headed for their brother Bill Dalton's ranch in California. The arrival of the members of the Dalton gang could not have come at a worse moment for Bill Dalton, as he was in the process for running as an assemblyman on a ticket against the Southern Pacific Railroad and their land grabbing methods. The problem was that just prior to the gang arriving, the Southern Pacific Express had been held up and robbed as it had passed through Tulare County. Suspicion fell upon the younger brothers, who were related to Bill Dalton, and his own brothers, who were wanted for a robbery in New Mexico. The railroad detectives dealing with the robbery saw a chance to get Bill Dalton off their backs and indicted Bill and Grat Dalton for the robbery. A second charge of a train robbery was laid against the 2 men, as witnesses placed both men at the scene. Grat Dalton feared that his record would go against him, and broke out of jail and hid out for some time in a cave. In the meantime, his brother Bill, who had not tried to escape, was tried and found not guilty. This, of course, acquitted his brother in absentia, because the evidence was that both men had been seen together committing the robberies. The incident ruined Bill Dalton both financially and politically, so he returned to the Indian Territories in an effort to rebuild his life. Finding it impossible to live within the law, Bill Dalton joined with the brothers, including Grat, who had found his way back, and the gang set about concentrating on the robbing of trains. Between May 1891 and July 1892, 4 trains were robbed in the Indian Territories, and it was all done with military precision. In October 1891, the gang robbed a train at Lilitia, Indian Territory, and relieved it of $10,000. The following year they struck again, this time at Red Rock, where they were robbed not only the express car, but also the passengers. Supremely confident, almost to the point of arrogance, the gang struck again, this time at Adair, Oklahoma, near the Arkansas border. Instead of stopping the train, they went to the station, robbed the express and baggage rooms, and then sat on a bench on the platform and waited for the train to arrive. As the train drew to a halt, some of the gang backed the wagon up to the doors of the express car and ordered the guard to open the doors. They then unloaded the contents of the car onto the wagon and then made off. In the meantime, other members of the gang engaged the guards in a gunfight, in which 3 of the guards were wounded and a stray bullet killed a local doctor. None of the gang were injured, and they escaped, realizing that this time they had been lucky. The Dalton gang decided that robbing of trains was becoming decidedly risky, as the railroad companies were putting more and more armed guards on board. It was decided to switch to robbing banks, and in a typical arrogant gesture, Bob Dalton decided that they would rob C.M. Condon and Company's bank and the First National Bank in Coffeyville, Kansas, in broad daylight. One of the problems they faced was the local people knew them, so it was decided to carry out the robberies in disguise. On the 5th of October 1892, at 9:30 a.m, 5 members of the Dalton gang rode into town. 3 of the gang, Grat Dalton, Bill Powers and Dick Broadwell, went into Condon's bank. The other 2, Bob and Emmett Dalton, entered the First National Bank. The first indications that the banks were being held up came from one of the tellers in the Condon bank. When he saw a Winchester rifle being pointed at him, his shout that the bank was being robbed alerted people outside, who then saw 2 other suspicious-looking men entering the First National Bank. The townspeople rallied, and a number of armed who had armed themselves with rifles started shooting at the robbers. In Condon's bank, the employees attempted to stall the robbers by saying that the safe was on a time lock and could not be opened for another 10 minutes. Grabbing what money he could, Grat Dalton asked if there was a back door, but was told there was none. Deciding to make a dash for their horses, the 3 men ran out of the bank, firing across the road as they did so. Grat Dalton and Bill Powers fell under a hail of bullets, whilst Dick Broadwell made a dash for his horse, but collapsed when the bullet smashed into his back. For a moment there was a lull in the firing, and Broadwell managed to pull himself onto his horse and started to ride out of town. He was then shot again, this time by a shotgun, but despite both bleeding profusely, his horse managed to get him clear. His body was later found half a mile outside of the town, crumpled up on the side of the road. It was discovered later that Grat Dalton, whilst exiting from the bank firing his gun, had shot Marshall Connolly in the back as he did so. In the First National Bank, Bob and Emmett Dalton had escaped down an alleyway alongside the bank. They came under fire from a store across the road from the bank, and one of the first volley of shots hit Bob Dalton, sending him crashing to the ground. He pulled himself up and sat on a pile of rocks and returned fire with his Winchester rifle. He got to his feet and attempted to move down the alleyway, but a second volley of shots sent him sprawling in the dust. His brother Emmett had managed to get to his horse and still had hold of the money. Instead of heading out of town, he turned to his horse and went back to try and drag his dying brother onto his horse. As he did so, one of the townspeople, Carey Seaman, emptied both barrels of his shotgun into him, and he fell beside his brother. Emmett Dalton survived the shooting. Suffering 23 wounds, he was later sentenced to life imprisonment in the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing. He was released after having served 14 years of his sentence, and died in California in 1937. After the train robbery, Bill Dalton decided to form his own gang, and on the 23rd of May 1894, Bill Dalton and his new gang robbed the First National Bank at Longview, Texas. This was their one and only job. Over the next few weeks, various posses hunting the robbers killed 3 of the gang and captured the other, who after a short trial was sent to prison for life. Bill Dalton was still on the run, but then on 8th of June 1894, a posse led by Deputy U.S. Marshal Buck Garrett, no relation to Sheriff Pat Garrett, from Ardmore in the Indian Territory, tracked Bill Dalton to his home in Pullville, Oklahoma. Garrett, together with Deputy James H. Mathers and 6 other deputies, surrounded the house and called for Bill Dalton to give himself up. He replied with a volley of shots, and the 2 parties exchanged gunfire for over 2 hours, in which the posse reported over 100 rounds being exchanged between them. Suddenly the firing stopped, and after getting no response from Dalton, deputies entered the cabin and found him dead, with a gunshot wound to the head. The violent days of the Daltons were finally over.